The week before Thanksgiving had been particularly brutal at the office. Not because of work pressure. Running Meridian Solutions, the largest business consulting firm on the West Coast, came naturally after 12 years of building it from nothing. The stress came from knowing I'd have to sit through another family dinner where everyone discussed my failure to launch, while I carved turkey and pretended their opinions mattered. My assistant Jessica had tried to convince me to skip it entirely. "Miss Thompson, you're closing the Morrison Industries deal next week. That's a $300 million restructuring contract. You don't need to subject yourself to this." But family was family, even when they thought you were a glorified coffee fetcher who'd never advanced beyond answering phones and scheduling meetings. The misconception had started 8 years ago, back when I was genuinely working as an executive assistant while building Meridian on nights and weekends. I'd taken the secretary job at Henderson and Associates specifically to learn how major consulting firms operated from the inside, how they pitched clients, managed projects, structured deals. Most MBA programs teach you theory. I wanted to understand the real mechanics of high-stakes business consulting. When family asked about work during those early days, I'd say I was working in business consulting, or helping companies with organizational restructuring. Somehow, this translated into "Sarah is a secretary," and once that narrative solidified, it became impossible to correct without seeming delusional. The first time I tried to explain that I'd started my own firm, Uncle Mike had chuckled and said, "That's great, honey. It's good to have goals." When I'd mentioned landing my first major client, a $50,000 contract to streamline a manufacturing company's operations, Dad had nodded approvingly and said, "See? All that experience answering phones is paying off. Maybe you can work your way up to office manager." Eventually I stopped trying to correct them. It was easier to let them maintain their delusions than to deal with their skepticism. And honestly, there was something darkly amusing about listening to them debate my career prospects while I was quietly building a consulting empire that would eventually employ half the business graduates they held up as success stories. But this Thanksgiving felt different. Maybe it was because Meridian had just been named Consulting Firm of the Year by Business Week. Maybe it was because we'd grown to 2,400 employees across 15 offices. Or maybe it was because I'd finally gotten tired of being treated like the family charity case at 30 years old. The dinner was being held at my parents' house in Bellevue, the same 4-bedroom colonial where I'd grown up, where family photos still showed me in my high school cap and gown next to my brother David's Harvard MBA and my sister Jennifer's medical degree. I arrived precisely at 3 p.m., carrying the green bean casserole I'd been assigned to bring. Mom greeted me at the door with her usual mixture of love and pity. "Sarah. Oh honey, you look tired. Are you getting enough sleep? I worry about you working such long hours for so little pay." "I'm fine, Mom. The casserole's still warm." "Wonderful. Everyone's already here. David flew in from New York and Jennifer drove up from Portland. They've been telling us about their latest promotions." Of course they had. David was a vice president at Goldman Sachs now. Jennifer had just been named head of cardiology at her hospital. Meanwhile, their sister Sarah was still answering phones and making coffee at some small consulting firm no one had heard of. The living room was full of the usual suspects. Dad was holding court from his recliner. Uncle Mike and Aunt Linda were on the couch with their twin boys, my cousins who were both fresh out of college and already making more money than their secretary aunt apparently ever would. Jennifer and David were standing by the fireplace, drinks in hand, looking every inch the successful professionals they were. "There she is," Dad announced as I entered. "Our little secretary. How are things at the office, sweetheart?" "Busy," I said simply, accepting the glass of wine Mom pressed into my hands. "I keep telling her she should look into going back to school," Mom said to the room. "Maybe get a business degree, try to move up in the world." David nodded seriously. "It's never too late to pivot, Sarah. I have connections at some good MBA programs. The application deadlines have passed for next fall, but maybe the year after." "That's very thoughtful," I replied, not mentioning that I'd been a guest lecturer at 3 MBA programs this semester, teaching case studies on organizational restructuring that I'd personally designed and implemented. "The problem is she's gotten comfortable," Jennifer chimed in, settling into her favorite role as the family's voice of tough love. 30 years old, same job for 8 years, no real ambition to advance. At some point you have to take responsibility for your own lack of progress. Uncle Mike leaned forward. "What kind of company is it again?" Henderson something. I actually left Henderson 6 years ago, I said. I work for a different firm now. Oh. Mom looked surprised. You never mentioned changing jobs. What's this new company called? Meridian Solutions. Dad frowned. Never heard of it. Is it bigger than Henderson? Somewhat, I said, not elaborating that Meridian's annual revenue was roughly 50 times what Henderson brought in. Well, as long as you're happy, Aunt Linda said with the kind of gentle condescension usually reserved for people discussing their stamp collections or model train hobbies. Dinner was the usual mix of family updates and pointed observations about everyone's career trajectories. David regaled us with stories from Goldman Sachs, the high-stakes deals, the international clients, the bonuses that exceeded most people's annual salaries. Jennifer talked about her latest surgical innovations and the research paper she was publishing in a major medical journal. Then the conversation turned to me. So Sarah, David said, cutting into his turkey, are you still doing the same kind of work? Filing, scheduling, that sort of thing. I handle client relationships and project management, I said carefully. That's great. Jennifer said encouragingly. So you've moved beyond just answering phones. That's real progress. Dad swallowed his mouthful of mashed potatoes. The important thing is that you're contributing something. Honest work has dignity, even if it's not glamorous. Absolutely, Uncle Mike agreed. Not everyone can be a doctor or investment banker. The world needs secretaries and administrative assistants too. Essential workers, Aunt Linda added, as if I deserved a pat on the head for my service to society's basic functioning. I was cutting my turkey very carefully, focusing on making precise, even slices while my family discussed my career like I was a mildly interesting case study in underachievement. The thing that worries me, Mom said, her voice taking on that particular maternal tone of loving concern, is what happens when you get older? Administrative work doesn't really have a growth trajectory. And you're 30 now, you need to start thinking about retirement savings, benefits, maybe buying a house someday. Your mother's right, Dad said, warming to one of his favorite subjects. I've been in manufacturing for 35 years, and I've seen plenty of people get comfortable in entry-level positions. They think they're fine, but then they wake up at 50 with no savings, no advancement, no security. David nodded seriously. The administrative job market is tough, especially for older workers. You might want to consider transitioning into something with more growth potential while you still can. Like what? I asked, genuinely curious about their career advice. Well, Jennifer said thoughtfully, you could go back to school. Get a degree in business administration, maybe human resources. Build on the skills you already have. Or you could look into government work, Uncle Mike suggested. The post office has good benefits. Job security. The post office? I repeated. Don't be snobby about it, Dad said sharply. Postal workers make decent money and they have pensions. That's more than you can say for most private sector administrative jobs. I took a sip of wine and tried to imagine explaining to my board of directors that my family thought I should consider a career change to mail delivery. The point is, Dad continued, really getting into his stride now, you can't just drift through life hoping things will work out. You're 30 years old, Sarah. 30. Most of your high school classmates are married, have kids, own homes, have real careers. What do you have to show for the last decade? The question hung in the air like smoke. Everyone was looking at me with varying degrees of pity and concern, waiting for me to acknowledge the fundamental disappointment I'd become. You know what your problem is? Dad said, his voice getting louder as he worked himself up. You have no drive. No ambition. You're content to just exist. To take the easy path, collect your little paycheck, go home to your apartment and watch Netflix. Dad, David said quietly, maybe ease up a little. No, she needs to hear this, Dad insisted. We've all been tiptoeing around it for years, but somebody has to tell her the truth. You'll never amount to anything, Sarah. Not with this attitude. 30 years old and still a secretary, still living paycheck to paycheck, still making excuses for why you haven't advanced in 8 years. The room went completely silent. Even the cousins had stopped scrolling through their phones to stare at this brutal family intervention. Success requires sacrifice, Dad continued relentlessly. It requires taking risks, working harder than the next person, refusing to settle for less than excellence. Look at your brother, Harvard MBA. Now he's managing billion-dollar portfolios. Look at your sister medical school residency, now she's saving lives every day. They didn't just coast through life accepting whatever scraps they were offered. I set down my fork and looked around the table at my family. These people who loved me enough to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner but thought so little of my capabilities that they genuinely believed I'd spent 30 years accomplishing essentially nothing. But you. Dad shook his head sadly. You took the first easy job you could find and never tried to do better. You'll never amount to anything because you don't want to amount to anything. Richard, Mom said softly, that's enough. Is it? Because I've been watching my daughter waste her potential for a decade, and I'm tired of pretending it's fine. She's 30 years old with nothing to show for it except a secretary job that any high school graduate could do. I picked up my wine glass and took a long, careful sip. You're right, Dad. I should probably be more ambitious. The agreement seemed to catch him off guard. He'd been prepared for defensiveness or tears, not acknowledgement. Well, he said, slightly deflated. Good. That's good that you recognize it. I do, I said calmly. In fact, I've been thinking about making some changes. Mom looked relieved. What kind of changes, sweetheart? Oh, just some adjustments to my current work situation. Nothing dramatic. The conversation moved on after that, but the mood had shifted. Dad seemed satisfied that he'd finally delivered the wake-up call I apparently needed. Mom was hopeful that maybe this would be the push to get me back on track. Jennifer and David were supportive but cautious, clearly worried that I might do something impulsive and make my situation even worse. I finished my dinner quietly, helped clear the table, and left around 7 p.m. with a container of leftover turkey and promises to think seriously about what Dad had said. The drive back to my penthouse apartment took 40 minutes. I spent most of it on a hands-free call with my head of mergers and acquisitions, finalizing details for Monday's announcement that Meridian Solutions would be acquiring Morrison Industries, the manufacturing conglomerate where my father had worked for 35 years. It wasn't personal. Morrison had been in financial trouble for 2 years, hemorrhaging money due to outdated processes and bloated management structures. We'd been approached by their board 6 months ago to handle the restructuring, but after reviewing their books, I'd recommended acquisition instead. At $2.8 billion, it was the largest deal in Meridian's history, but Morrison's supply chain relationships and manufacturing capabilities were exactly what we needed to expand into industrial consulting. The fact that Dad worked there was purely coincidental. The fact that Monday's acquisition would put me in control of his payroll was just serendipitous timing. I spent Saturday morning reviewing the final contracts and Sunday afternoon at the office, briefing my senior partners on the integration timeline. Morrison's employees would be notified Monday morning, after the markets opened and the acquisition was officially announced. Most would keep their jobs. I wasn't interested in destroying lives just to improve profit margins, but there would definitely be some management restructuring. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear. I was in my office by 6 a.m., watching the pre-market trading while my legal team handled the final paperwork. At 9:30 a.m. Eastern, the opening bell rang, and Meridian Solutions officially became the parent company of Morrison Industries. The press release went out at 10 a.m. Pacific Time. Meridian Solutions completes $2.8 billion acquisition of Morrison Industries, read the headline in the Wall Street Journal. The article included a photo of me shaking hands with Morrison's former CEO, along with a quote about our plans to preserve Morrison's manufacturing excellence while implementing Meridian's proven operational efficiency models. Dad's phone call came at 10:47 a.m. Sarah. His voice was strained, confused. Honey, I need to ask you something and I need you to tell me the truth. What's wrong, Dad? I just got an email about some kind of corporate restructuring at Morrison. They're saying we've been acquired by a company called Meridian Solutions. And the thing is... He paused and I could hear papers rustling. The thing is, that's the company you work for, isn't it? I was sitting at my desk on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center, looking out at Elliott Bay while my father tried to process what he was seeing on his computer screen. Yes, I said simply. But that doesn't make sense. You're a secretary there. Actually, Dad, I'm the founder and CEO. The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. That's not possible, he finally said. I started Meridian 12 years ago while I was working at Henderson and Associates. Remember? I kept telling you I was building my own consulting firm, But you thought I meant I was hoping to get promoted to office manager someday. More silence. Sarah, this isn't funny. Morrison Industries is a $3 billion company. 2.8 billion, actually. That's what we paid for it. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, trying to make sense of information that didn't fit his understanding of reality. This is impossible, he said again. You work as a secretary. You answer phones. I used to work as a secretary 8 years ago while I was learning the consulting business from the inside. I haven't answered phones since 2018. But you never said. I tried to tell you, Dad. For years. Every time I mentioned starting my own firm, you thought it was a cute fantasy. Every time I talked about landing new clients, you assumed I meant my boss was giving me more filing to do. Every time I tried to explain what Meridian actually did, you nodded politely and changed the subject. The papers were rustling again. I could picture him scrolling through the press release, seeing my name listed as CEO and founder of the company that had just purchased his employer. Sarah Elizabeth Thompson, he read aloud, his voice hollow. Founder and Chief Executive Officer of Meridian Solutions. Age 30. Recognized as Business Week's Consulting Executive of the Year. That's me. You're 30 years old, he said weakly. Yes. And you own the company that just bought Morrison Industries. I own 68% of Meridian Solutions, which as of this morning owns 100% of Morrison Industries. Another long pause. How much? His voice cracked. How much is your company worth? I looked at the latest valuation report on my desk. Based on this morning's acquisition, the investment banks are estimating Meridian's total value at around $12.3 billion. The phone went completely silent. For a moment I thought he'd hung up, but then I heard what sounded like him sitting down heavily in a chair. $12 billion, he whispered. Give or take. You're worth $12 billion? Well, 68% of $12 billion, so closer to $8 billion personally. Though most of that is tied up in company equity, not liquid assets. I heard Mom's voice in the background asking what was wrong. Dad's voice was muffled as he explained to her that our secretary daughter had apparently just bought his company. Sarah, he said, coming back to the phone, I don't understand any of this. How is this possible? When did this happen? It's been happening for 12 years, Dad. Meridian started with me and 2 partners working out of my apartment. Our first major client was a small tech company that needed help streamlining their operations. I charged them $50,000 for 6 months of work. We used that money to rent a real office and hire our first employees. I could hear Mom in the background now, her voice getting higher as Dad apparently showed her something on his computer. By year 3, we had 40 employees and were handling restructuring projects for mid-sized companies. Year 5, we opened our second office in Portland. Year 7, we went international with an office in London. Last year, we opened our 15th location in Singapore. 15 locations? Dad's voice was barely audible. We employ 2,400 people across North America, Europe, and Asia. Our clients include about 40% of the Fortune 500. We've handled restructuring projects worth over $60 billion in total value. Mom had apparently taken the phone from Dad. Sarah, honey, is this some kind of joke? She said. Because if it is, it's not funny. Your father is having chest pains. It's not a joke, Mom. Google Sarah Thompson Meridian Solutions if you want to see the news coverage. I heard rapid typing, then Mom's gasp. Oh my God. Richard, she's on the cover of Forbes magazine. She's on the Forbes magazine cover, Richard. Dad's voice came back, shaky and confused. The Forbes thing. When was that? 6 months ago. The article was about women entrepreneurs who built billion-dollar companies before age 35. They interviewed me for 3 hours about Meridian's growth strategy. Why didn't you tell us? The question I'd been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair and looked out at the Seattle skyline, a city where I now employed more people than some companies had total customers. I tried to tell you, Dad. For 12 years I tried. Every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every family gathering I tried to explain what I was building. But you'd already decided who I was, the secretary daughter who'd never amount to anything, and nothing I said could change that narrative. But we would have been proud of you, Mom said, her voice thick with emotion. We would have celebrated with you. Would you have? Because last Thursday you spent 2 hours telling me I needed to go back to school, maybe look into government work. definitely get more ambitious about my career prospects. David suggested the post office might be a good fit. The silence was deafening. You told me I had no drive, no ambition, that I was content to just exist and collect my little paycheck, I continued. You said I'd never amount to anything because I didn't want to amount to anything. Sarah, we didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. Not once, in 12 years, did anyone in this family ask me a direct question about what my actual job responsibilities were. You assumed I was answering phones because that fit your expectations and you never looked deeper. I could hear Dad crying in the background now. Mom's voice was shaky when she spoke again. What does this mean for Morrison? For your father's job. Dad's job is safe. Everyone's job is safe, actually. We're not planning any layoffs. Morrison's problems are structural and process-related, not personnel-related. We'll be implementing new systems and providing additional training, but we need experienced people to help with the transition. And your father, he'll be working for you now? I considered this. Dad was a quality control supervisor, good at his job, well respected by his team. He was also about to discover that his 30-year-old secretary daughter was now his ultimate boss. Technically, he works for Morrison Industries, which is now a wholly owned subsidiary of Meridian Solutions. I don't get involved in day-to-day personnel decisions at our acquired companies. But you could fire him if you wanted to. I could fire anyone I wanted to, Mom. I could shut down the entire company if I felt like it. That's what ownership means. The weight of this seemed to be settling in. Their secretary daughter, the family disappointment, the one who'd never amount to anything, now controlled the livelihood of not just Dad, but his 3,400 co-workers. Sarah, Dad's voice came back, stronger now but still shaky, I owe you an apology. A big one. You owe me 12 years of apologies, Dad. You're right. God, you're absolutely right. We've all been so wrong about you. So completely wrong. Yes, you have. Can you forgive us? Can you forgive me for what I said on Thursday? I thought about this question while watching a container ship navigate through Elliott Bay 42 floors below. In a few hours, I'd be in a board meeting discussing our expansion into South American markets. Tomorrow, I was flying to London to personally oversee the opening of our newest European office. Next week, I'd be testifying before a Senate committee about international trade policies that could affect our clients' global operations. But right now I was just a daughter whose family had finally realized they'd been wrong about her for over a decade. I forgive you, Dad. But things are going to be different now. Different how? Well, for starters, no more career advice. I think I've got that area pretty well handled. I heard him laugh, a shaky, emotional sound that might have been part sob. And no more assumptions about what I do for work. If you want to know something about my life, ask me directly. Don't fill in the blanks with whatever fits your expectations. Yes. Absolutely. And Dad? When we're together as a family, I'm still just Sarah. I'm still your daughter. The business stuff stays separate unless you specifically want to know about it. I do want to know about it, he said quickly. All of it. Everything we missed. I smiled, looking at the framed photo on my desk, a picture of me at 8 years old, wearing a business suit for career day at school, holding a sign that said Future C. Well, I said, we've got plenty of time to catch up. Starting with this weekend's family dinner. Jennifer and David are going to be very surprised to learn what their secretary sister has been up to. Sarah, Mom said softly, we love you. We've always loved you. We didn't understand. I know, Mom. And I love you too. But next time someone in this family claims to know what's best for my career, maybe remember this conversation. After I hung up, I sat quietly in my office for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. My assistant knocked and entered with the afternoon's schedule, 3 client meetings, a conference call with our London office, and a working dinner with the team handling our expansion into renewable energy consulting. Everything all right, Miss Thompson? Jessica asked, noting my expression. Just some family business, I said, straightening my suit jacket. Nothing that can't wait until after we finish revolutionizing the consulting industry. She smiled and left me to prepare for the afternoon meetings. Through my office windows, Seattle spread out below like a map of possibilities. Somewhere out there, my father was probably still staring at his computer screen, trying to reconcile 30 years of assumptions with the reality that his secretary daughter now owned his company. It would take time for the family dynamics to adjust. Years probably. But for the first time in over a decade, I wouldn't have to sit through Thanksgiving dinner listening to career advice from people who thought I needed help finding a job with better benefits. Sometimes the best revenge really is massive success. Even when it takes your family 12 years to notice you achieved it.